thank you. I was going to say I feel like a fish out of water, but I don't actually work on fish. I work on aquatic invertebrates, macroinvertebrates, bugs. So that's what we're talking about today. So how riparian vegetation supports aquatic insects, which, as you all know, is a major component of the trout diet. So why are we doing this? And obviously it's already been mentioned today that many of the trout fishers, particularly in the Goulburn region where we are today, have been concerned about decreases of aquatic insects in the upper Goulburn River. So we wanted to explore, well, what's going on here? What could be happening? And so on to aquatic insects. Why do we care about them? Well, you all know why we care. You're all trout fishers. They're an important food source for trout. There's other food sources which are terrestrial insects. So we've got a stoveflake caddis at the top and an imitation of that. So aquatic insects are really important in the diet of trout. Terrestrial insects are particularly important as well, and can account for up to 50% of the diet. But today our focus is on aquatic insects and that association with riparian vegetation. So these declines in aquatic insects, what might be happening in the system? And we're looking at riparian vegetation changes over time. So, sorry I haven't got an example from the Upper Goulburn, but just for the purposes of this image represents a really good system, really good native intact riparian vegetation. And then we have a transition in the right-hand photo to willow dominated as an example. So there's a clear difference between these two images and in the makeup of the riparian vegetation that's there. So what we wanted to look at was, well, are there particular associations between what's happening with riparian vegetation changes and the aquatic insects in the Upper Goulburn system? And we are hoping to get the information out of this so that we could inform riparian revegetation programs and identify some of those knowledge gaps. So what did we do? Well, we asked the question, and the question was, do aquatic insects need specific riparian vegetation? So certain species of plants, whether they be grasses, shrubs, trees. Our answer, after having looked thoroughly through the literature and also speaking to a number of anglers on their observations as well, that we had no specific association. So unlike the terrestrial insects, for example, there's the spotted Jezebel butterfly in the Goulburn Broken, which the caterpillars rely on certain species of plants to feed on. We don't have that in aquatic insects, so we couldn't find that association. So basically we had to change the focus of what we were doing to say, what role is riparian vegetation playing in supporting our aquatic insects, which in turn support fishes and trout? So if we look at this, another image of riparian vegetation, it's got everything that we want and it's critical in providing temperature, but you've got to think about it on that catchment scale. It's critical in stabilising banks, and it's critical in filtering sediment nutrients in the catchment itself. And losses or changes to the riparian zone are pretty obvious and can result in scenes like this. This one is, that's an extreme example. We've completely lost that riparian zone. The channel's been incised. It's a disaster. So I think we all know what happens when we remove that riparian zone. So let's look at riparian vegetation for aquatic insects. And there's two critical things to think of here. It's delivering food, it's dropping leaves, it's dropping limbs, all that sort of thing. And this is also habitat. So think of it as in-stream habitat and on-bank habitat. So we're going to concentrate on the food part of it now. Don't worry about the detail of this. This is a stylised food web. So it's about all the interactions between our riparian zone. So we've got our sun providing the energy for our plants to provide energy for aquatic invertebrates, and they include aquatic insects like mayflies, caddisflies. They in turn are providing food for our fish like trout. So as a food source, This riparian vegetation is providing all sorts of detritus in the stream. So we've got leaves coming in, we've got sticks, we've got, large pieces of wood. And in turn, our aquatic insects use different pieces of this material. The Kosciuszko mayfly, or the grizzly mayfly, I think it's called, that basically filter feeds detritus in the water. Then we've got things like our mayflies. This particular one will chew through leaves and shred leaves. And then we've got things like our stonefly in the bottom here, and they'll eat wood and little sticks and things like that. So it's critical that we've got this detritus coming into the system from our banks, from the riparian vegetation, to feed our aquatic insects. Then think about on bank. So on bank, the riparian vegetation is also providing a food source. And it's providing a food source for those adults of the aquatic insects, so the ones that have emerged from the water, for those adults that actually feed. I've given an example of a stonefly here because stonefly adults are relatively long-lived and they absolutely rely on that riparian zone to feed on rotting wood, lichens. In fact, a couple of families of stoneflies in Australia are totally dependent on acquiring this good nutrition from the riparian zone for their egg development. So without it, they've got no chance. By the way, don't even try and imitate that stonefly. It's a threatened species. You can't do it. So then we go to habitat. So this riparian vegetation is delivering all this stuff into the stream. This is actually providing structures in the water. So these are places that aquatic invertebrates can live. So they're underwater structures, and it's critical habitat for these aquatic insects to have. So it's providing a really diverse structure under the water. Riparian vegetation is also providing that habitat on the banks. We've got a small mass of snowflake caddis, and they're using the carex as a point to mass around, and as adults on those banks using those things for shelter and for feeding and for mating. Then we've got habitat as well. Now this is in the water, caddisflies, big in the diet of trout fish. There's a lot of caddis with cases, and they use materials that have dropped from the riparian vegetation into the water. The point about that is they don't actually use things like introduced species like willows because they're too soft, they break down too quickly, and they get eaten by other things. So they're using this year-round available material that's durable, that's stable over time. It's there for them to use. The riparian vegetation, as well as logs sticking out of the stream, provide really important emergence points for aquatic insects. So, of course, the larval stage, which is in the water, has to emerge from the water to develop into the adult stage. They need those stable structures that are emerging from the water, like your logs, like your vegetation. You might have grasses next to the bank, small shrubs, and they use those to emerge onto. And without it, some of them will drown if they don't find a stable emergence point. So that structure again is really important. Riparian vegetation also provide really important egg-laying sites. So the female will lay eggs into wood that's in the water. Without some riparian vegetation to deliver that into the stream, she'd have nowhere to lay. There'd be no future generations of that dragonfly. Mayflies, and we've got damselflies as well, which often lay into aquatic vegetation in the water. So that's another important point in terms of vegetation. So we can think about services that riparian vegetation provides. So we've got water temperature regulation. So it manages those extremes in water temperature. We've got bank stability. We've got that sediment and nutrient filtering from the catchment around it. So it acts like that little buffer strip that's holding that sediment and those nutrients coming in from elsewhere in the catchment. And we've got the food source. So in stream, our riparian vegetation is providing that critical food source for our aquatic insects. And what I must say, and John's already mentioned it, our aquatic insects, and all of our invertebrates indeed, have actually evolved with our native vegetation. Our riparian also provides that habitat, and that habitat is critical as well. And that goes from shelter sites to egg-laying sites to emergence sites to things like our caddisfly cases. Without it, we're missing all of those things, and then we're missing all of our aquatic insects. So this leads us back to the riparian vegetation. It's that diversity of structure, of different types of plants to provide all those things that our aquatic insects need. Benefits of native riparian vegetation. Like John mentioned before, something like a willow will drop it all its leaves in autumn, and that's it. That resource is not available for the rest of the year. Our native vegetation is dropping all year round, so that's available all year round. And it's durable, it doesn't decompose quickly. So it's providing that long-lasting food source. So how does this affect what Goldenbroke and CMA are doing? So these are some of the examples of riparian plantings by the CMA. And so you can see what a huge difference it is from the before shots on the left to the after shots on the right. This is an example from Tumbling Waters on the Rubicon. It's a really good planting. It's really abundant, it's really diverse, but the other key thing is that it's providing access for fishes. And so it's not only ticking environmental boxes, but it's ticking that social box for recreational fishing. So riparian plantings, what do we know? Natives best. Natives providing that durable resource all year round. That aquatic insects use, and we want to plant for that diversity. So plant trees, shrubs, grasses, and this is going to meet the requirements of our aquatic insects. Other aspects that we can consider: the role of riparian zones in supporting terrestrials, the links between detritus from specific riparian plants. So for example, what do caddis use for their cases? And then other habitat enhancements as well, like boulder seeding, in-stream woody habitat. There may be aquatic vegetation that you can establish as well. So these are other important aspects to consider. And my acknowledgements to JD and Anthony and all the other people that helped out. Thank you.
Authorised by Victorian Government, 1 Treasury Place, Melbourne.